Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. Today's topic is going to be on bilingual education. So this one's not really from the textbook. Most of this stuff is based in our Taiwan context and maybe a few definitions, and then I'll kind of talk about what's important for our educational context here in Taiwan and why we care, what should we care about. Even if you are an English teacher, these are things that we need to know if we're going to be full-time teachers in the future. Okay, so let me get started here. Okay, so let's first of all define bilingual education. So bilingual education is teaching academic content in two languages. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make in Taiwan is that they hear bilingual education and everyone automatically thinks more English, more English, more English. Now, that's true, but at the same time, it's not just about the English, it's about English and Chinese together, or whatever the two languages are. Now, the amount of the native language and the secondary language, it depends. And every school will have their own wishes. I know some schools will actually give percentages like 70% and 30% or something. I think that's a little bit hard to define what 70% and 30% mean. But I mean, we have to start somewhere. So some schools will say 50-50 or just do your best. It really depends on the context. Now, one of the misnomers here about bilingual education in Taiwan is that, you just run a few extra English subject classes, like maybe PE, we use English sometimes, maybe 20-30%, and fine arts, we use English, 15-20%. Okay, we have bilingual education, but actually that's not really true by definition. It should be English and Chinese in our Taiwan context, together implemented throughout the entire curriculum, all the courses or most of the courses. So actually this takes a lot of planning. If you are the director, even the principal, you need to have a curriculum in which all of the courses could be connected in some way with English and Chinese. Okay. So in Taiwan, of course, we have what's called the twofold vision. We've got Bilingual Taiwan 2030. That's what our goal is. And the two main areas are that we want to connect Taiwan's workforce with the world. Now, this one is actually quite applicable to those of you who are English majors. And some of you may already be thinking about traveling abroad after you graduate, maybe going to grad school abroad, or even working in some type of international company. So this is very real. The better your English is, the better opportunities you have, more doors that you can open, or another language. It doesn't have to be English, but of course in Taiwan, that's the language that we're focused on right now. But the other side is also attracting international enterprises to Taiwan. That's the goal, or that's the hope. Okay, so looking at the 6 goals of bilingual Taiwan, these are written by the Ministry of Education. The first is to accelerate the development of bilingual higher education. And the second one is to balance and optimize bilingual conditions for schools at senior high school and below. So basically, from elementary school up to university, we're trying to have balanced education in which the students are still learning the important content, but we're also adding English into the courses as well. The third one is to develop digital learning, and the fourth one is to expand provision of affordable English proficiency tests. Number 5 is to raise civil servants' English proficiency, and then number 6, to establish an administrative body dedicated to policy promotion and implementation. Now, for this video, we're not going to talk about the politics or whether we think it's going to work or not. All I want to point out is, for any of this to happen, it needs to be accepted in the schools. And as long as we start in the elementary school age, in fact, I would suggest maybe the kindergarten age, and we start to add more English into subjects, And of course, when these students graduate from high school, their English abilities will be better. And so if I want to be a civil servant and my English is better, then therefore we have raised our civil servants' English proficiency. And this will be true for any context, any job, any discipline that you're studying in. Okay, now in Taiwan, there are 3 types of common bilingual education. There's EMI, there's CLIL, and there's CBI. Okay, so let me briefly define each one. Okay, so EMI, if you've never heard of it before, it stands for English as a Medium of Instruction. Medium here means the mode that we're using. So basically, you're using English as the language for teaching. Okay. But how is that different from your regular English class? The central focus is on students' content mastery and no language aims are specified. Or if you look at the second definition, you're focusing on content learning only. So basically, and there's a third definition down below you can look at as well. Basically, what it means is we're using English to teach another subject like math or art or anything. But our focus is not on improving their English per se. It's on learning the content of that subject. Now, of course, in a perfect world, if you use English to teach a content, their English is going to improve. But as a teacher, I'm not going to evaluate the improvements in their English proficiency. I'm going to assess or evaluate whether they learned the content of my subject. Okay, the second one is CLIL. And CLIL is Content and Language Integrated Learning. So go through a couple definitions here. The first one, diverse methodologies are used which lead to dual-focused education where attention is given to both the topic and the language. So now I'm not just focused on teaching the subject. I'm also focused on improving their English proficiency or whatever language that we're focused on. And you see the second one, dual-focused educational approach. It's a fusion of both subject, content, and language learning. So as a teacher, that means I'm going to assess them on their content learning, also on their language improvement, their English proficiency. So I want, in a perfect world, both of them to improve at the same time. Okay, then the third one is CBI, which is content-based instruction. Now, this is an integrated approach to language instruction. So it's language instruction, drawing topics, text, and tasks from content or subject matter classes, but focusing on cognitive academic language skills. So this is the opposite of EMI. We're using English to improve their English abilities, but we're not using the typical English textbook topics. In this case, we're taking some other content, like maybe science material. And you know, a lot of the magazines and textbooks today, they try to do this. They don't just focus on typical English textbook topics. Maybe they have a social studies page or an economics page or a math page. But the main focus is not really on improving your social studies knowledge. Maybe you will, but the main focus is on improving your English proficiency. Okay, now I have this nice little chart or diagram here, so maybe this will be a little bit easier for you to understand. So you can see over here, we have the focus on language, so that's content-based instruction. And a lot of English teachers do this sometimes. And then on the far right end is our focus on content, so that's EMI. And then CLIL is anywhere in the middle here. Maybe we want to focus more on content and less on language. And that's kind of what's happening in Taiwan with a lot of subject teachers, because maybe they feel their English ability is not good enough. And so they want to focus more on the content. Maybe you're an English teacher and you're being asked to do CLIL. So maybe your focus is more on the language side over there. Okay. Okay, so let me talk about CLIL a little bit. CLIL is widely used right now. It's used more in Taipei and Taichung, Tainan, but in Kaohsiung is definitely starting to pick up steam. In this video, I'm not going to go too deep, but I'd like to give you the basic nuts and bolts of it, as we say. So typically in CLIL, we have what's called the 4 C's or 5 C's. So you can see a bunch of words here that start with C. We've got content, communication, cognition, culture, and context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some main points of CLIL and what the 4 C's are. I won't talk too much about contexts today. Okay. So first, a few notes. CLIL is more of a teaching philosophy. It's not necessarily a teaching method, which means if you're running a CLIL program, you still have to choose your teaching method. Now, most CLIL proponents will recommend that you use communicative-based teaching, task-based teaching, project-based teaching, things like that. Okay, as I mentioned before, it is a dual focus method of instruction. So you're focusing on the content and the language. The reason is that students need to survive and communicate in a globalized world. So learning vocabulary and grammar, it's not enough. And what's good about CLIL is that it matches the Ministry of Education's core competencies. That's something that we'll look at in a future class. And one major point on CLIL, because I think some teachers, they're not really sure how to use English, the first thing they will do is just translate the key vocabulary into English, and then they will think that they are running a CLIL program. That's not necessarily true. Content knowledge doesn't just mean learning some vocabulary, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Okay, so some benefits of CLIL. Because we're focused on content and language at the same time, so it does promote linguistic competence. It does promote content knowledge. But even better is it stimulates the student's cognitive flexibility. It enriches the understanding of concepts, and learners are able to advance to a more sophisticated level of learning, critical thinking, problem solving. And it can increase learner motivation. It's very learner-centered, and therefore maybe it can increase learning autonomy. And it also allows educators flexibility because, as I mentioned before, you have the choice whether or not you want to focus more on content or focus more on the language or try to balance them in the middle. And so as a teacher, if your English proficiency is very good, then you can also focus on improving their linguistic competence. If you're more of a master of the subject and not as good at the English, then maybe you can focus more on content. And obviously the curriculum designers as well, they can have a lot of flexibility in how they set this up. Okay, I want to quickly go through the 4 C's, okay? So the first one is content. So the content, of course, it can be a school subject like math or science, or it could be a topic of interest like living things, bridges, painting, anything. Anything can be a topic. Now, the content leads the way for the entire set of lessons. Of course, you have to choose the content first. And as I mentioned before, content knowledge is not just the key language terms, but also the skills and different types of knowledge that they will need in order to complete the tasks in your classroom. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. Okay, the second one is cognition. Now, if you want students to learn content knowledge, you have to activate their cognition. Now, probably some of you have heard of Bloom's taxonomy before. But I like to use one by Krathwohl and Anderson. It's actually Bloom's taxonomy, but they revised it a little bit to make it look a little bit different. And so I'm going to show you that one right now. Okay, so this is called the cognitive process dimension. And this is a big table. It's cut into what we call lower order processing and higher order processing. So we'll start with the lower order processing first. The reason I like this revision is it gives me a lot of cool verbs in this table as well. So we've got remembering, understanding, and applying. These are the skills we want students to do while learning the content and using English at the same time. So we have students recognize, recall, interpret, exemplify, classify, summarize, infer, compare, explain. And in applying means execute and implement. Now, I think in most English type classes, these skills, they're used a lot, right? Remember and understand. Okay, but this is lower order. They're important, but they're not the end goal. We also want to get to the higher order processing skills of analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And so, you look at things like differentiating, organizing, attributing, checking, critiquing, generating, planning, producing. We want students to do these type of skills while using English. And that way we can really guarantee that they are learning deeper knowledge. And at the same time, while they do that, they're really going to strengthen their English skills. Okay, and the last part about this cognition table, we'll call it, is the knowledge dimension. So actually there are 4 main types of knowledge that we want our students to learn. It's factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. So factual knowledge is your basic information, your terminology, okay? But then there's conceptual knowledge. So the knowledge of classifications and categories, knowledge of principles and generalizations, knowledge of theories, and so on. And then there's procedural knowledge. So the knowledge of subject-specific skills and algorithms, knowledge of subject techniques, knowledge of criteria for determining when to use procedures, everything about how to do something. And then the last one is metacognitive knowledge. This is your knowledge of thinking in general and individual thinking in particular. So this is thinking about what's going on inside your own brain. So your own strategic knowledge, your knowledge about cognitive tasks, and your knowledge about yourself, what you're good at, what you're bad at. Okay. The third one is communications. Remember, we're going through the 4 C's. We had content, cognition, and now it's communication. So communication is basically the language you need for the students to learn the content and have their cognition activated. So in order for them to learn what you're trying to teach and to do the tasks in class that you want them to do, they need the language. If you want them to do it in English, they might not have it. And so this is where the teacher is very important, because you're going to give them the language that they need and let them practice it in your class. Now, when we separate communication into the language, we have 3 different types, okay? And this is called the language triptych. We have language of learning, language for learning, and language through learning. You don't need to memorize this stuff, but it's good that you understand it so that you can use it later on. Okay, so the first one is called language of learning. This is the language that the students need, to learn the content material. This is typically your target vocabulary. Okay, then if you look on the right side, we have language for learning. This is the language they need so that they can use the target vocabulary. It's typically sentence patterns and questions that the students have already learned before. So the new stuff is usually the language of learning. Now, I want them to use the new vocabulary in a communicative way. So we need to use sentence patterns and questions that maybe they already have learned, but we're going to push those ones on them so that they can practice, right? Improve their automaticity. Connect grammar they learned in their English class to the vocabulary that they're learning in their science class. Okay, then the third one is language through learning. This is the language that they learned as a result of being in your CLIL class. So actually, as a teacher, maybe you're not really preparing for them to learn, but just because they're in the class, they learn the content. They learn the language. So for example, maybe the language they need to ask the teacher questions, or words that show up while they're doing tasks. Okay. So here's an example of the language triptych. And this is actually a class that I taught to elementary school students in the past. So you can see we've got language of, language for, and language through. So language of learning, remember this is the new language I want them to learn as part of the content. So mine was on insects, and I wanted the students to be able to describe an insect. I wanted them to be able to tell, is it an insect or not an insect? And I wanted them to learn about the life cycle of an insect. So what's stage 1, what's stage 2, and so on. So the vocabulary here, you can see this is grade 5 or grade 6, I forget. We've got insect, thorax, abdomen, and on, all these words. And then the language for learning. So I don't want them to be able to say these words individually. I want them to use those words in communication. And so we practice these sentences. Statements to describe insects. An insect has 6 legs. An insect has 2 antennae. Statements to classify the types of insects. A beetle is an insect. A spider is not an insect. And then questions for group interaction with each other. Is it a beetle? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Is it a spider? Is it an insect? Okay, and then maybe how do you spell something, or what does life cycle mean? So we practice these sentences throughout all of our lessons. And so the students were able to actually communicate with each other using the new language. Okay, and then the last one is language through learning. So since the class is over, I can say that they actually learned a lot of language through communicating in class. Things like soil, spray, water, grass, be careful, and language that you use as a teacher when you interact with them. So maybe you give them some feedback and then they respond. They learn that language as well. Okay, so the fourth one is culture. Okay, now culture, one note about it is that culture is not just holidays and festivals from other countries. When we talk about culture, you want the students to be pluricultural, which means they are learning how to interact with other people. They're learning about the different people in their own culture. They're learning about people from different cultures. They're learning how to take care of the environment. So basically, it's like how to be a better person, how to be sensitive to other people. So actually, it's a lot of different factors involved. And when you design your lesson, culture should always play a role with the other 3 C's. It should be embedded inside of your lesson plan. Okay. Now, the last thing I wanted to show here is what we call the CLIL matrix. Okay, so since we're focused on the language and the content, we are considering the students' linguistic demands as well as their cognitive demands on the left-hand side. Now, when we start, maybe not just CLIL, but any type of English class, we should always be starting in box number 1. So the tasks that you ask them to do should be linguistically easy and cognitively easy. So you're starting with those lower processing skills like remembering and understanding. But eventually you want to move up into quadrant 2 and you want to increase the cognitive demands. So you want them to use those higher order skills. And hopefully you can finally make it into quadrant number 3, which is higher order thinking skills with higher levels of English use. That's the main goal. If you make it into quadrant 4, that's typically for your English classes that you're focusing mostly on the language and not on the cognitive skills as well, like a CLIL class should. Okay, now I want to move on to EMI. Okay, so briefly talk about the difference. So obviously, if you're teaching EMI, it means you should be using English to teach the subject, right? And your focus is only on the content. So you can imagine how difficult this would be for, say, a math teacher who is now asked to teach math using English. This is a major challenge. Okay, so here's a definition. This comes from the EMI enhancement plan here in Taiwan. English courses in which the learning is focused on language rather than subject content should not be considered as EMI courses. However, the importance of ESL, EAP, ESP courses should be emphasized, and the contribution of English teachers should be considered essential for the successful provision of EMI courses. This means that universities, high schools, and so on should give English courses and teachers a prominent role in their EMI enhancement plan. So as the English abilities improve in Taiwan, it's English teachers who may play a major role in this because you might be asked to help the subject classes. You may even be asked to teach them if your content knowledge is good enough. Okay. So second definition is for EMI courses, that delivery of content, whole class interaction, learning materials, and the demonstration and assessment of learning outcomes should be in English. Okay, so that's the main goal. In theory and by definition, an EMI course means that you are doing everything in English, 100%, which may not be realistic in Taiwan, so they do have an extra definition here for us. Okay, so other languages may be used in a principled way in specific circumstances. For example, student-to-student, teacher-to-student interaction during pair work and group work may sometimes take place in languages other than English to aid mutual comprehension and idea generation. We call this translanguaging. So translanguaging means you're using all of the languages inside of your brain in order to give your best answer. So this should be encouraged. However, in an EMI course, students should be asked to present their discussion outcomes in English, and lectures should ensure that at least 70% of class communication takes place in English. Good EMI course practice should encourage the students to engage in English speaking and writing as much as possible. So you can see 70%. Now that's a very random number in my opinion, but it's a lot. It means basically using as much English as possible. Now, whether or not the teacher and students can take that is another issue. So really, EMI is still in its beginning stages. Okay, so as a teacher, in my opinion, instead of focusing on this 70% number, I think there's a better way to look at it. Now, if you're planning for an EMI course, and I think that as English teachers, this is also important for your own classes, you have to ask yourself, why? Why am I using English 100% of the time? So for these other subjects where they're not typically using English, they have to also ask, okay, so what kind of class am I? And we have what's called hardcore EMI and softcore EMI. Now, hardcore EMI means that it's because of policy. That's why I'm using English. These particular subjects could be taught in the student's L1, so that would be Chinese here for us. But we want to use English because we want to improve their English ability. So like physics, engineering, sociology, economics, geology, geography. These type of courses in Taiwan, in university or in high school or in junior high school, could be taught 100% in Chinese, and students will be fine in the future. They will be successful. Okay, then we have what's called softcore EMI. Now, these are more language-led. In these type of courses, English is helpful or even necessary for students to be successful in the future after they graduate from university. So we've got like e-commerce, international business, internet studies, and then of course applied linguistics and TESOL, where English is not just because I want their English to improve. We actually need English in order to be more successful. So it's different from the other subjects. Okay. Now, I want to talk about disciplinary literacy. So disciplinary literacy is something that we can use in order to ask ourselves, how much English do we need and what type of English should we be using in these type of EMI courses where it's not English class, it's math class, it's physics class, it's social studies, whatever the class is. Okay, so I want to talk about something called discipline. Discipline is the main subject area that we're studying. Like, I'm an engineer, that's my discipline. I'm an English teacher, that's my discipline, okay? Which discipline you're from will affect the attitude of teachers and students towards using English. So for example, if you're in the sciences, actually knowledge doesn't change no matter what language you use, right? E equals MC squared in English equals E equals MC squared in Chinese, which equals E equals MC squared in Japanese, probably, I'm sure. But in humanities, for example, like you, knowledge can change with language based on the interpretation. So does education equals education? Taiwan education, does that equal Canadian education? Does that equal Korean education? maybe not, right? And when you use English, I mean, look at what we talk about in this class. We're talking about communicative language learning, things like that. So it changes the attitudes. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so disciplinary literacy refers to the ability to appropriately participate in the communicative practices of a discipline. So that means if I graduate from university and I'm an engineer, I need to be able to use my language in a way to be successful as an engineer. So does that mean I only need to use Chinese, or do I need to use English? If I need to use English, why? For what? In my work? In society? When I'm at school? Why do I need to use English? And if we look at it this way, even as a junior high school teacher, if you're teaching these subject classes, you should start thinking about this as, okay, so my main goal is to prepare my students for high school. And then in high school, their main goal is to prepare them for university. And then in university, their goal is to prepare them for working outside, right? And so in junior high school, what is the language that my students are going to need in order to succeed in high school? Okay, so let me move on. So this is from John Airy. Students must be able to participate in a mixture of 3 distinct communities. So they need to be able to survive in the academic world, right? University, after you graduate, are you still a part of academia? Are you doing research? Are you publishing materials? Are you teaching there? Is that what they do? Okay. And then the second one is society. So are you using your knowledge that you learn in school while you're a part of society? And then, of course, the workplace. Okay, so these 3 communities could be all used, or maybe one particular discipline only focuses on one of them. So let me give you an example, because I'm sure this might be a little bit confusing. Okay, so the first one, this is what the triangle looks like, okay? So we got society up here, we got the workplace here, and we got academy here. Remember, academy means, well, academia, doing research, publishing papers. For example, here, let me go through the examples and then maybe you'll understand. So the first one is physics. Now this comes from John Airy himself. He is a physicist. And he said that most physicists, after they graduate, they're a part of the academy. And workplace is basically the academy. That's the way he put it. And so the language that the students need once they graduate is all academy based. Okay, so that means if I'm teaching physics students, do they need English in order to succeed in academia? Now, if you think about doing research and reading on the internet, probably, right? Most research today is actually done in English. And so as a teacher, you have to prepare your students for research in English. Now, maybe they don't need to learn how to use English at the bus stop or anything like that. That's for English class, but they need to know how to read academic articles. They need to know how to write in English. And so as a physics teacher, that's where your focus can be. Okay, the next one is nursing. So as a nurse, when I become a nurse, I'm going to use my knowledge probably in a mixture between society and the workplace. And so I need to be prepared for that. Do I need English as a nurse? It's helpful for sure, especially if you're working in a hospital because you have many international patients. Okay, then how about a historian? A historian is probably a mixture between academy and society. And then the last one is an engineer. So engineers probably need to be a mixture of all 3 in the workplace, in the academy, and society. And I would say a doctor is also a mixture between the 3. Doctors do research still. Doctors are always doctors, even as a part of society. They do presentations, they go to conferences. And then, of course, in the hospital, you're a doctor as well. And so since they need to survive in all 3 areas, now we need to think about the language that they would use in all of these areas. Okay, so what John Airy did is he created what's called a disciplinary literacy discussion matrix. And anyone who's designing an EMI course can use it as a starting place. For the matrix, though, you have to really. I'm going to show you the matrix in a second. You have to have your objectives and tasks geared towards the matrix, which is geared towards the skills and language your students need when they graduate. And you can also use it for your own course evaluation. Okay, so let me show you the matrix here. This is what it looks like. Okay, so this is an example for Taiwan. So as a teacher, I have to ask myself, okay, let's use doctor as example because that needs all three. So as a doctor, I'm going to be a part of the academy. Doctors do research. They read research articles, and some of them teach, right? They teach in universities. Now, this part I'm not so sure on because I'm not a doctor, but do they need to read, write, speak, and listen in Chinese? Well, probably, right? But do they need to read, write, speak, and listen in English? Yes, they do. They need to do their research in English. Most doctors do. So they need to be strong at all four skills. So as an EMI teacher in the medical field, I need to promote all four of them. How about the workplace? Yes, of course they need Chinese. They need English as well. How about in society? Of course they need Chinese in society. And then in English, this one could be up for debate. We could discuss that one. Now down here, there's other modes as well. So you could have other languages, or if I'm a math teacher, do they need to learn how to read graphs? Do they need to know how to draw tables? Do they need to know how to design diagrams? Are they learning mathematic formulas? And so as an EMI teacher at any level, instead of thinking 70% English, you should be thinking about the specific skills your students are going to need when they move up to the next level. I hope that makes sense. This is something that we can talk about later in class. Okay, so the last slide today, and this is very important, not really for you, but for subject teachers. But I think it's kind of summarizes our whole bilingual 2030 here, and that a lot of teachers who are not English teachers think that why should they use English? They're not English teachers. Okay, but I like this quote. It says, until lecturers see their role as one of socializing students into the discourse of their discipline, there can be no discussion of disciplinary literacy goals. Without such a discussion, lecturers will continue to insist that they are not language teachers and that this should be a job for someone else. So if we go back to this table for a second, think about it like this. You're a math teacher. Let's use science. You're a science teacher, and maybe you're teaching biology. And your students, maybe they complain about using English in the biology class. This is biology class. Why are we using English? And maybe the teacher complains too. They also don't want to use English. That's the English teacher's job. They teach English. But English teachers don't teach you how to read and write a biology report. They don't teach you how to use English to do an experiment. But when these students graduate from university and they want to go to a good school, they may be asked to use English in their EMI courses in order to survive, in order to thrive. And maybe those particular skills were never taught by their science teachers because they said they are not English teachers. So if everyone starts to think in this way, then I believe that the idea of bilingual education will be possible and can be successful. Okay, everybody, that is it for today. I hope everything here was understandable, and I will see all of you next time. Okay, take care and bye-bye.